It's a distinct pleasure for me to be here at Yale Divinity School this afternoon. I would like to thank Dean Sterling for this kind invitation to give this year's Ensign lecture, which affords me the chance to pause from my globetrotting and to think systematically, if only briefly, about the work in the State Department at the intersection of religion and diplomacy. I'm also pleased to give the remarks in the H. Richard Niebuhr room, in particular, despite the other Niebuhr reference. From time to time, I like to chide my friends in the field of international relations that their recent discovery of religion as a force in a legitimate category of analysis is nice. But scholars of religion have studied this subject for centuries, and if not millennia, and they've been granting degrees related to the topic at least since the 13th century. So I welcome them to the party. I welcome them to this discussion. Now, I don't need to remind people in this room of the legacy of the Niebuhr brothers here at Yale and about their engagement with issues of religion in international politics. Having studied myself with the likes of Richard R. Niebuhr, Ronald Thiemann, Gordon Kaufman, and Harvey Cox, the legacy of H. Richard Niebuhr is deeply embedded in my own scholarly DNA. And I'm thinking particularly of his interest in the historical and empirical in his work. His path-breaking synthesis of Karl Barth and Ernst Troeltsch remains so fruitful for interpreting our own age of chaos, crisis, and transition. So I think it's fitting that we spend time together today, here in the shadow of H. Richard Niebuhr, assessing the current attempt of the State Department to develop a more sophisticated approach to religion and global affairs. I'm going to proceed in 4 distinct movements today. The first movement will be a brief historical overview of how the State Department has approached religion in recent years and how the advent of the Office of Religion and Global Affairs stands against that background. The second movement sets out the structure and mission of our office. The third movement describes some examples of the concrete work we do around the globe. And finally, the final movement outlines some observations about the interplay of diplomacy and the scholarly study of religion. And then I hope we have time for question and answer after I'm done. So how has the State Department approached religion before the launch of our office? So I should begin by saying the Department of State has many offices that deal with religion far beyond our own. So it's not, is the State Department going to deal with religion or not? It has been dealing with religion. The real question is it going to get better and more sophisticated at it as a result of our modest efforts? Now, in recent years, the dominant approaches to religion in the State Department were 2. First, through the lens of international religious freedom, and second, religion and conflict. And while there may be proponents in both camps outside of the Department of State who would argue that one or the other of those categories should be the comprehensive approach to religion, neither taken alone exhausts the relevance of religion to diplomacy. Put simply, the political and social implications of religion are too complex and too large to be circumscribed by either of these approaches taken alone. Now, that's not to deny, however, the ongoing relevance and importance of international religious freedom and the study of religion and conflict. To fully understand the current iteration of our office, one has to go back to 2005, when a mutual friend introduced me to then Senator John Kerry. That friend, Mike McCurry, which some of you may recognize, joined the 2004 Kerry presidential campaign in the closing weeks of the general election. In the course of the post-election analysis of that unsuccessful campaign, at least from Mr. Kerry's perspective, McCurry suggested to the senator that he meet me, given our mutual interest in religion and presidential politics and our mutual interest in religion and American foreign policy. Thus, at some point in 2005, I found myself engaged in a series of conversations with the senator. He has remarked in public that the odd couple nature of our relationship, that is, a New England Yankee Roman Catholic and a low-church Protestant Southern boy, not to mention the greatest of incommensurate American intellectual gulfs, Yale grad versus Harvard grad. But despite those gulfs, we found a way forward. Testimony, at least to his formidable diplomatic skills in bridging deep political, philosophical divides, which we now actually see bearing fruit in other arenas around the globe. Fast forward to 2013, and not long after he was sworn in as Secretary of State, he learned that he had the legal authority to launch an Office of Religion Advisor. and he invited me to leave the comforts of academia and launch the Office of Religion and Global Affairs, an invitation that I accepted after about 90 seconds of negotiation. His belief at the time was that the United States had not engaged religious actors and assessed religious dynamics around the world as effectively as it could have. Now, again, to be sure, many offices address religion in the State Department. He hired me to try to increase that sophistication and capacity. His charge to me was to build an office that could advise him when religion cut across his portfolio, to also expand the capacity of the State Department to engage religious actors, and then lastly, to serve as the portal for various entities, including religious groups, non-governmental actors, civil society, or academic centers or think tanks, to help us explore how various offices and bureaus in the State Department might benefit from learning about their work and from their accomplishments. So that's the general background. The second movement is to look at the structure, the mission, and the vision of our office. Now, 2 years in, we have built a staff of 30, possessing over 20 graduate degrees in religion or a cognate field. Now, at one level, that sounds very impressive. But if you look at the background of 80,000 employees in the State Department, it begins to look very small. And when you look at a globe populated with 7 billion people, by some social scientific measures, 80-some percentage of those 7 billion profess some sort of affiliation to a religious group, we have our work cut out for us. The first organizational task was to gather 3 different principles that had been distributed across the State Department bureaucracy, but who had some equities with respect to religion, so they were consolidated into my office. These include Sharik Zuffer, who is the special representative to Muslim communities, Ira Foreman, the special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism, and Arslan Suleiman, the acting special envoy to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. There was a feeling that there were synergies to be harvested there if we all came together from our disparate spots to be in the Secretary's Bureau, which is a very centrally located office. The other center of gravity that we created in our office was a team of 6 regional advisors to be our liaisons to the 6 regional bureaus of the State Department. The State Department divides the world into these 6 somewhat justifiable, somewhat arbitrary demarcations of the whole planet. And if we were going to be successful in socializing our mission to engage religious actors and assess religious dynamics, we had to collaborate with the regional bureaus, because that's really where the heart and the soul of American diplomacy resides. Without successfully convincing them of the relevance of our mission to their diplomatic success, our office would simply be a shiny bauble of an office located on the Secretary's team, but with no impact on American diplomacy around the world. Now, I should say at the outset, as a scholar of religion, I firmly reject any essentialist notion that there's a single essence of religion that can be named and then applied globally to every entity considered by someone to be religious. Nor did we construct a single definition of what constitutes religion. Indeed, we've built an eclectic team with regional knowledge of lived religion, and we've built networks of analysis which help us hone our understanding of religion in context, without a preconception of religion abstractly conceived. If the State Department was to become more sophisticated about religion, given the complexity of religion around the globe, we are going to have to model an approach that recognizes the complexity and ambiguity of religion and not adopt a reductive approach that simplifies matters that should not be simplified. At the same time, we couldn't simply throw up our hands and say that religion is such an unstable term that it possesses no analytical utility. So how do we describe the vision of our approach? Simply put, we envision a stronger U.S. foreign policy through an effective approach to religious dynamics and actors. And there are 4 components to this more effective approach. It has to be strategic, it has to be comprehensive, it has to be inclusive and critical. Let me unpack each of these in order. When we aspire to be strategic in an effective approach to religious actors and dynamics, we mean one that engages key issues and groups to advance priority diplomatic and national security equities. We do not do our work in a vacuum. We try to align our work with the policy priorities set by the Secretary and the senior leadership of the department. That means we have to be attentive to the priorities of U.S. foreign policy. This does not always lend itself to quick and easy deliverables that some in our current political climate demand frequently. Max Weber's old aphorism about politics in his famous essay, Politics as Vocation, I think also applies to diplomacy. He said, politics is a strong and slow boring of hard boards. It takes both passion and perspective. And certainly the job of understanding the global role of lived religion is a slow, painstaking process. So by concentrating on strategically important issues in countries, our work often focuses on complex and long-standing problems. Increasingly, the strategic priorities of our regional advisors are aligning with the strategic priorities of the regional bureaus as we make the case to them that engaging religious actors and having a deeper understanding of the political and social implications of lived religion will lead to diplomatic progress. One need not go back very far in U.S. history to identify tragic failures of policy, fed in large part by an appalling failure to understand the dynamics of religion and to effectively engage important religious actors. When we pursue a vision, then, that is comprehensive, we mean one that addresses all foreign policy priorities where religion is relevant. Now, that's a daunting task, including those where religion is not always recognized as an immediate or direct factor. This doesn't mean that we believe religion is relevant everywhere in every policy arena. Part of our work is right-sizing the role of religion in complex policy questions. There are analysts in the religious freedom space who believe that advancing religious freedom cures all political ills. Likewise, there are those in the religion and conflicts world who have a reductive view that sees this universe through the stereotype of bad Muslims and good Muslims, or even worse, moderate Muslims. We look for nuance and complexity where some pursue simplicity and stereotype. Our vision also seeks to be inclusive in that we reach beyond official leaders and institutions to include communities. If we only engage official leaders, we would fail in at least two ways. First, much of the formal religious leadership is male. So to meet only official leaders is to woefully miss the actual power of lived religion, especially if we miss the gendered nature of much global religious leadership. It requires extra labor and analysis to engage members of religious communities who are not senior leaders. In many contexts, senior leaders do not want U.S. government employees meeting with someone other than themselves. The second failure is that there's often a great diversity of opinion and experience within a religious community, and meeting only with senior leaders masks this diversity and can lead to radical misunderstandings on the parts of American diplomats. One strategy we employ in the pursuit of inclusivity is to encourage our embassies and posts to work consciously to expand their routine engagement with religious groups beyond formal leaders. U.S. embassies and posts build robust networks of civil society contacts as a routine part of their diplomacy. We encourage them to think inclusively when it comes to religious actors, and we often help them expand their networks of engagement. There have been some critics who argue that any government engagement with religious communities has to be biased and discriminate between approved groups and non-approved groups. We've adopted a different strategy, one that is committed to inclusivity. We meet with any group that wants to meet with us. There is no official or unofficial list of endorsed or proscribed religious groups. Our only limitation is that we cannot meet with groups that are explicitly committed to violence. Our vision commits us to being critical in the best sense of that term. That is, we recognize the complexity, ambiguity, and diversity of lived religion through consultation with religious actors and academics and civil society experts. While we believe religion matters in diplomacy, we are acutely aware of the messiness of this realm of lived religion. While we do have expertise, we know that in our complex world, we do not know all there is to know or to be learned about religion in context. We are a learning organization, and we routinely work to get smarter by leveraging expertise outside of our own office. I should add, too, that we are neither immune to criticism nor are we afraid of it. As one who routinely criticized the foreign policy of previous administration, I would be the rankest of hypocrites if I suddenly decried any criticism aimed at our office. We are deeply committed to deliberative democracy and thus routinely meet with harsh, moderate, and marginal critics of administration policies. I call it playing the piñata, but it's not in my text. My third movement then asks, what are some concrete examples of the work we do? I may truncate my list here. I've got 4 examples. I'm probably going to cut a couple of those out, but just to give you a sample of the many lines of effort we have around the globe. In the spring of this year, while attending a Congress of African religious leaders in Benin, I met with a small gathering of diverse religious broadcasters in Cotonou, Benin. In our conversation, which started out simply as a sort of a meet and greet formal meeting, it became apparent that all of these groups were united in the belief that corruption was a top challenge facing both their government and indeed their entire society. In recent years, the government of Benin has lost significant international development money because of corruption allegations. But in consultation with the embassy staff, we decided to work with this eclectic group of religious broadcasters to secure public diplomacy funding for these broadcasters to meet together and to air anti-corruption stories, and they found solidarity and protection by working together with a small grant from the United States Department's public diplomacy program. Now, shortly after that visit to Western Africa, President Muhammadu Buhari was elected next door in Nigeria. Upon taking office, he cited anti-corruption as one of his 3 primary governing goals. Based upon our experience next door in Benin, we set out to find if we could seize opportunities to engage religious actors in Nigeria to support the president's efforts to combat corruption. Early next year, we hope to collaborate with the U.S. Consulate in Lagos, Nigeria, to host a workshop of anti-corruption efforts with key religious leaders and anti-corruption experts from around the globe. This workshop will address the role religious leaders can play in combating corruption and seek innovative ways to engage religious communities to build a more transparent and just society in Nigeria. The workshop will aim to, number 1, highlight the role of religious leaders and institutions in preventing corruption. 2, provide training on best practices to these religious communities. And 3, to promote standards of accountability, transparency, and integrity. It's our belief that these religious communities, and specifically the leaders, can be powerful voices in combating corruption in the wider Nigerian society. Convening these leaders and providing space for communication in which they can have a full and frank discussion about corruption would allow them the opportunity to discuss how corruption has had an impact on their lives and in their own congregations. Anti-corruption training would provide tools for enhanced transparency that would allow these communities to lead by example. It should also then now, on a second issue, come as no surprise that religious actors are at the forefront of the global effort to mitigate and adapt to global climate change and its consequences. The last class I taught at Wesleyan Theological Seminary before I joined the State Department in July of 2013 was to lead a cohort of seminary students on a 2-week intercultural immersion trip to the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. For years, Wesley has required students to do this kind of intercultural trip, and we've sent students all across the world. I was hiking in Yellowstone 4 summers ago, thinking how blissfully far from DC culture this space was, and a light bulb went off in my head. I could have been paid for years to bring students to this space as part of an intercultural immersion trip. So it took a little persuading of the curriculum committee, but they endorsed the greater Yellowstone ecosystem as another culture compared to DC. So they bought my argument, and there I took the students where we studied the impact of global climate change with some of the world's leading climate change scientists. We met with national park staff and a raft of civil society groups in Bozeman, Montana, where, by the way, I've learned there are more nonprofit organizations per capita than any other city in the United States. While also reading some of the more important moral and policy literature on climate change. So this is an issue that I feel in my bones as a theological ethicist. But the question was, how could I translate this professional academic interest into supporting global climate change policy once I got inside the State Department? Now, in collaboration with the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, Every year, the State Department hires a small cadre of senior scientists to spend a year in the State Department working on public policy, called the Jefferson Science Fellowship. To make a long story short, in summer of 2014, I got a Jefferson Science Fellow into the Religion and Foreign Global Affairs Office of the State Department. And her name was Dr. Alice Bean, an internationally renowned experimental physicist who teaches at Kansas University. I asked her to do three things for me. I said, number one, map the offices in the executive branch of the U.S. government that deal with climate policy. Secondly, I said, map the global religious-related non-governmental organizations in the world that deal with climate issues. And number three, construct a strategy for building a bridge between the two in order to help the religious groups become more literate about the administration's policy proposals, and then help those policy shops understand how these religious civil society groups could magnify and shape our climate policy going forward. Now, after a year, our office has conducted a series of roundtables, briefings, and conference calls implementing the strategy that she designed for our office. This work will culminate next month in a religion and climate change symposium we are co-sponsoring with the Berkeley Center at Georgetown University. 2015 has been a very active year for the administration in the climate policy arena, and through our work, we have sought to enlist aid of religiously motivated actors here and abroad. As we move closer to the global climate negotiations, which will culminate in Paris in December, the so-called COP21 negotiations, where we also hope to launch the International Green Climate Fund, religious actors, along with the business community and the security community, are among the most critical players on the planet as we pursue a successful United Nations Framework Convention on climate change. Our work has helped to make sure religious actors are a vital part of that policy process. The third specific case I want to mention has to do with Cuba policy. On December 17, 2014, President Obama announced a new course in our relationship with Cuba, calling for a series of updated policies highlighted by establishing diplomatic ties with Cuba. We all know the pivotal role the Vatican played in helping to bridge or broker this policy breakthrough. Early then in 2015, shortly after the president's new policy, our office convened a gathering of over 60 religious leaders drawn from a broad sector of religious groups, faith-based civil society organizations, as well as faith-based development and humanitarian agencies, to hear from a series of experts drawn from the Treasury Department, the White House, the Commerce Department, and the State Department. This briefing outlined the regulatory changes President Obama had announced on a wide range of topics relevant to those actors, including travel and remittance liberalization and the expansion of commercial sales and exports. We are currently hoping to engage in Cuba to build ties between a wide range of Cuban religious communities and the staff in our embassy in Havana. We want to make sure that our embassy staff there is able to develop strong relationships with civil society actors, including religious ones, in order to help us build stronger diplomatic ties to Cuba. I was going to talk some about our work in Ukraine. I'm going to skip over that. If you want to ask me questions about that in the Q&A, we can do that, but I want to make sure we have plenty of time left. The last example I want to mention relates to a series of religion and foreign policy working groups that we administer out of our office. As part of the Secretary's dialogue with civil society, the State Department convenes a number of regular consultation with a broad range of organizations in American public life. In the spring of this year, we conducted 4 working groups related to religion. One of these deals with international religious freedom, one on religion and sustainable development and humanitarian assistance, one on religion and social justice, which focuses on the rights of LGBTI persons, and one on religion and conflict mitigation. Each of these groups was comprised of external actors who came into the State Department to give us specific advice on specific policies. We're going to be launching another round of those groups to start the dialogue this winter on those issues, but also an expanded roster, including issues around gender, training for diplomats to be able to do religious engagement more effectively, and addressing anti-sectarianism in Iraq. So that gives you some sense of the flavor of the many kinds of programs we do around the world. As I say, if you've got questions, I'm happy to field them. There are many other lines of effort, but I think those are indicative of some of the kinds of different work we do around the globe. Now, in my final movement, I want to answer, how should the academic study of religion and its guild relate to this work? Now, let me again reiterate, there are many offices in the State Department that deal with religion. It's one of our goals that we can be the conduit through which academic experts can come into the State Department and begin to have an influence on this wider range of offices, not simply our own work. As I mentioned, we have over 20 graduate degrees in religion or a cognate field on our staff, including 4 of us with doctorates and with teaching experience. So we've got a wide and robust and growing network of global scholars who advise us, and we routinely solicit that advice. Given our interest in lived religion and our rejection of an essentialist approach, we're interested in the rapid growth of understanding of religion's contextual and embedded nature and how that can make us more effective and smarter in our diplomatic work. Likewise, we are the beneficiaries of a Henry Luce Foundation liberal grant to the American Academy of Religion to fund scholarly sabbatical fellowships for religion scholars to come into the State Department to advise us for a season. This January, we anticipate the first 2 such fellows joining us in our office for a year. Now, I have to admit, when the AAR partnered with the Luce Foundation, I had no idea if anybody would be interested in applying for these fellowships. My understanding is that 50 people applied for what's going to turn out this iteration to be 2 fellowships. So I'm pretty pleased with that quick and deep response. I believe it signals the high interest among scholars of religion in wanting to shape diplomacy for the better. Now, on the other hand, there's been a range of questions raised over the advisability of the U.S. government expanding its capacity in engaging religious actors around the globe. So I want to list a handful of those questions very briefly and then give you a quick response. And again, I should hasten to add that in the last 15 years, I have convened or sat on innumerable panels at the annual meetings of the American Academy of Religion on precisely this topic. So these are old and deep arguments that I'm quite familiar with. The first argument is that the United States government must have an impoverished or reduced understanding of religion. Given our emphasis on lived religion and our strong, diverse academic training, the alleged inevitability of this seems misplaced. Our treatment of religion is no different from approaches to other socially constructed categories such as gender, race, the political, or the economic. Those who advance this critique, I think, reveal both their exceptionalism with respect to religion and also betray, in Richard Bernstein's felicitous phrase, a certain Cartesian anxiety, because they deem religion to be inherently unstable and thus not a fit category for analysis. Absent some sort of epistemological foundations, a conception like religion has no utility to these critics, and we simply reject that. The second argument we sometimes encounter is that the U.S. government must project religious identity onto social actors that cannot be reduced simply to religion. Again, in fact, we seek to understand the complex interplay between the religious and multiple other dimensions of peoples and organizations. Against the insistence that government analysts are incapable of perceiving this complex interplay, seems to me projects a fundamental misunderstanding of the capacity of well-trained diplomats. Thirdly, we're sometimes accused of instrumentalizing religious actors. After all, it's argued policy by its nature instrumentalizes the world. I would simply say that this infantilizes religious actors and betrays a lack of understanding of the work of many of them and their desire to bend the policies of what they perceive to be a more moral direction. This criticism, which is always a possibility, governments can in fact instrumentalize large groups of people, I don't think it accurately captures the nature of our interaction with religious actors. In my experience, given the literal thousands of people we have met with in the 2 years of our existence, they seem to be capable of holding their own in the face of the United States government. And in fact, they're quite adept at criticizing us and communicating their wants and needs very powerfully and very effectively. Fourth, some people argue that we impose liberal human rights norms on religious organizations as a precondition for engagement. On the contrary, it's perfectly possible for us to find areas of overlapping consensus and common objectives even when we start from very, very different worldviews. Lastly, some have argued that we inevitably oppose a good Muslim / bad Muslim frame on the 1.6 billion Muslims around the world, or that we scan the globe trying to create these so-called moderate Muslims. Again, we actually work to reject such simple dichotomies while trying to bring a more sophisticated understanding to our peers across the executive branch. The overall tone of the inevitability piece of these arguments, I think, reflects an ironic essentialist view not of religion, but of government policy and government actors. That is, our critics do to policy what they think we do to religion, and it is they impose a narrow, reductionist framework. So to summarize, our relationship with the Guild, I think it's fair to say, is deep, it's robust, it's productive, and it's crucial. And we welcome the give and take, and we're stronger as a result of the critical interaction we have with the Guild. So to conclude, let me return to Hans Frey and to H. Richard Niebuhr, two names very much well known in the hallowed halls here. In September 1998, Yale Divinity School and Harvard Divinity School, in a refreshing display of theological diplomatic detente, sponsored a conference on the work of H. Richard Niebuhr, marking the 25th anniversary of his death. The lead article in the volume of essays that was published as an outcome of that conference was written by Hans Frey, and it was entitled H. Richard Niebuhr on History, Church, and Nation. Now, the day before that conference was to take place, Hans Frey suffered what proved to be a fatal stroke, and he died sometime later. So this is perhaps the last essay that he wrote. Now, he had some essays published posthumously, but I do believe this was the last thing he may have actually written. Let me read the opening lines to that essay. A distant but very distinct fragment of a layer of memories remains from the days of World War II at Yale Divinity School. H. Richard Niebuhr, introduced by Ralph Gabriel, a name some of you may know. He was the Sterling Professor of History here at Yale in that time. But Niebuhr gave a lecture on the post-war aims. And Frey says there were many lectures of this sort in those bleak days when no decisive turn had yet come in the war's fortunes. Apparently no manuscript or notes of his talk are extant, but the heart of what he said was powerful. Our innocence, he said, was gone. That innocence so much associated with our previous semi-detached place among the great powers with whom we associated. We were now a worldwide empire. We could either exercise our position with restraint or recklessly, with a heavy hand that could not rest until it had encircled the globe. That and that alone was now our difficult choice. Now, I relay that story because I see parallels between that period and what we face in our own context. Niebuhr was worried about the new international order that was to emerge from the wreckage of World War II. No one could have foreseen the precise dimensions of the Cold War as he spoke in the early 1940s, nor foreseen the forces and global institutions that eventually came at the end of the war and in the Cold War era. But he was deeply concerned about how the United States would comport itself in that yet is unforeseen age. Likewise, I think we are in an era of great change in the international system, and no one can predict exactly what that international system is going to look like when it is emerging. Now, international relations scholars debate the emerging new powers of non-state actors, including the religiously motivated ones. My point is that now, and as then, scholars of religion have powerful contributions to make in the difficult task of interpreting the emerging global order. It is my good fortune to help the U.S. State Department strengthen its capacity to engage religious actors and assess religious dynamics in order to craft a stronger and wiser American foreign policy. I like to believe that visionaries such as H. Richard Niebuhr would support our work. Thank you very much.